Mr. President, I ask consent that the remarks I'm about to be making be placed in a separate part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last month, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals rejected an attempt by the venerable corporation Johnson & Johnson, which sought to make a mockery of our system of justice and bankruptcy laws. In this case, Johnson & Johnson tried to use a legal scheme known as the Texas two-step. It's an accurate name because it would have allowed Johnson & Johnson to dance around its obligations to the consumers it had harmed. And this not a few people were already talking about. This case concerns 40,000 Americans who used Johnson & Johnson products and have been diagnosed with ovarian cancer or mesothelioma. Let's start from the beginning. For years, Johnson & Johnson denied that talcum powder, its product known as baby powder, contained asbestos. They denied it, but the company's internal documents tell a different story. They indicate that Johnson & Johnson was aware for decades that its products contained asbestos, but J&J kept those products on the market anyway, and consumers who trusted the brand kept using them. In the years that followed, tens of thousands of these loyal customers were diagnosed with debilitating and in some cases terminal illness. Eventually, many of the same customers filed lawsuits against Johnson & Johnson. But because before most of the claims against the company could be heard, Johnson & Johnson closed the doors to the courtroom. It used this so-called Texas two-step to transfer its legal liabilities to a shell company. And then, step two, had the shell company declare bankruptcy. Here's the important part. When the shell company declared bankruptcy, Johnson & Johnson asked the court to freeze all ongoing litigation. That maneuver effectively prevented the company's victims from proceeding with their cases. Instead, these victims would have to get in line in bankruptcy court along with many creditors and wait for some small payment years ahead. That was Johnson & Johnson's devious scheme. And it was all going according to plan until last month, when the Third Circuit stepped in and stopped the music on Johnson & Johnson's Texas two-step. The Third Circuit ruled that Johnson & Johnson's shell company had not acted in good faith when it declared bankruptcy. They were right. The Third Circuit's ruling is an important victory, but the tragic reality is for some of the Johnson & Johnson baby powder victims who sought justice, it was too little, too late. One of those victims was Kimberly Naranjo. Throughout her life, Ms. Naranjo was a model of resilience. She grew up surrounded by addiction and abuse, spent her teenage years moving from one foster home to another. Ms. Naranjo also struggled with addiction herself, but at the age of 19, she had her first child and she changed course in her life. She set herself on the path to recovery and resolved to provide her 7 children the stability and love she never knew. Eventually, Ms. Naranjo found her calling. She earned a degree in alcohol and drug counseling, landed her dream job supporting other people on their path to recovery. But then, 3 days into her new job, Ms. Naranjo felt a pain in her side. She went to the doctor who diagnosed her with mesothelioma. Soon after her diagnosis, Ms. Naranjo determined that the only way she could have been exposed to asbestos was through that so-called safe baby powder she used on all of her children, Johnson & Johnson baby powder. Last year, the Judiciary Committee, which I chair, held a hearing on corporate use of bankruptcy. We included Johnson & Johnson's use of the Texas two-step. We were joined by Mrs. Naranjo, who shared her story. She told the committee, and I quote, "When I learned that I could file a lawsuit against Johnson & Johnson and have it decided by a jury, I finally saw a path forward for my family." She continued, and I quote, "That hope was taken from me. I learned that Johnson & Johnson filed for bankruptcy and that I would not receive a court date." Ms. Naranjo died from her illness last month, weeks before turning 50, and weeks before the Third Circuit's ruling against Johnson & Johnson. She never received the justice she deserved. Make no mistake, as long as the world's biggest, wealthiest companies have the ability to game our legal system and escape liability, there will be more tragic stories like Mrs. Naranjo's. Because Johnson & Johnson is not alone in abusing bankruptcy law, to avoid accountability, and that's a fact. In fact, other very large, very solvent companies are getting in on the game. One similar case is currently being considered by the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeal. This one concerns a familiar name, 3M, and its subsidiary, Aero Technologies. Like Johnson & Johnson, 3M is trying to game the bankruptcy system to avoid accountability to its customers. And these are not your average consumers. In this case, we're talking about 230,000 military veterans. So what happened? These veterans claim they suffered hearing loss because they wore defective earplugs while in service to our country. These earplugs were manufactured by 3M and that subsidiary I mentioned, Aero Technologies. And when those veterans came forward with their allegations, 3M turned the same get-out-of-jail card that Johnson & Johnson tried to use. Aero declared bankruptcy, and then 3M, which is certainly not bankrupt, promptly asked the court to use the bankruptcy stay to freeze all ongoing earplug litigation from American veterans. So instead of facing the lawsuit that these veterans bought, 3M is trying to use Chapter 11 bankruptcy to lock the doors to the courtroom. How about that? Fortunately, in this case, a judge refused to let 3M get away with it. Last August, a bankruptcy court ruled against the company's cynical legal scheme. But instead of changing course on this shady strategy, Aero Technologies of 3M fame appealed the case to the Seventh Circuit. Earlier this month, I led a number of my colleagues in the Senate and House in submitting an amicus brief to the Seventh Circuit. In it, we wrote that Congress did not intend for the bankruptcy system to serve as a get-out-of-the-jail-free card for wealthy corporations facing litigation, especially from American veterans. I hope the Seventh Circuit joins the Third Circuit in ruling against these schemes to deny Americans and veterans their day in court. But the truth is, these companies are trying to game a system that we in Congress created. As lawmakers, we write the laws and the rules for declaring Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So really, we have the responsibility to step up and confront these corporate abusers of bankruptcy. We must work together to keep the doors of our justice system open to every American seeking their day in court. I believe the Senate is capable of doing things, even hard things. I believe we can bring America closer to our central aspiration of justice. And I believe we can still instill more faith in this nation of laws by ending these corporate abuses of bankruptcy once and for all. Mr. President, I yield the floor.